Hello, and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the book show that will boldly go where no book show has ever gone before and talk about Aurora 7 by Thomas Mallon. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this show, this is the book show where every week I look at a book that was important to James Ellroy. And Aurora 7 is actually the third book by Thomas Mallon we've covered, which has to be a record. He and Ellroy are very close friends, and Ellroy admires all of his works. And this book actually is useful for me to bring out some surprising connections Ellroy has with science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy writers. Okay, so Aurora 7 was the 1962 space flight where Scott Carpenter became the fourth American in space, and the mission was to orbit the world 3 times. And this is a novel, so Thomas Mallon has this kind of bystanders of history design to his novels. This was only actually his second novel. It came out in 1990. He'd had some great success as a non-fiction writer, and subsequently he's had the same success as a fiction writer, although I don't think he's ever kind of cracked the New York Times bestseller list, but that's not important. He is a spectacularly good writer, and a lot of his books are better than most books you'd find on the NYT bestseller list. So the bystanders of history design is you take a random bunch of characters and you set it, and it's set on the specific day where Carpenter goes into space. And these characters are firstly President Kennedy, and we get some fascinating snippets into his mindset in the White House, in that particular day in 1962. And he's got a lot of stresses, which naturally the presidency brings. He's got a healthcare bill that the Republicans are giving him trouble for, and the space flights originally, the space race originally came about because the Russians got there first and America was catching up, and he's also worried about his vow to get Americans on the moon by the end of the decade. He's thinking, I'm never going to do it, and they're going to track me down to Cape Caldwell. I'll be retired, and it's going to be a humiliation. Of course, we know that didn't happen. Thankfully, Americans did land on the moon in Apollo 11, and sadly, President Kennedy never got to retire. And speaking of which, another bystander is Lee Harvey Oswald, who is currently, re-entering the United States after his short-lived, rather lamentable defection to the Soviet Union. Those are the kind of famous characters. There are more kind of ordinary people, a New York cabbie, an acerbic writer, and most of all, a young boy, Gregory Noonan, and the entire Noonan family. But the boy is completely entranced by the Aurora 7 space flight and everything about space exploration. So he plays hooky after school, and he tries to follow it himself. And these characters intersect along with descriptions of Carpenter's flight, including some actual verbatim transcripts of Carpenter and ground control, where they're talking through the various objectives of the mission. There were numerous science experiments that he had to commit up there. He was also the first man to eat solids in space. And the book climaxes with the space flight, due to kind of error of which there's much debate whether it was kind of Carpenter's fault or ground control's fault. It may have been a bit of both, but he actually delayed his flight landing, and he was 250 miles off where he was supposed to land, and he was, in the eyes of the public, he was missing for about an hour. And the only one who was giving kind of wall-to-wall coverage of this was Walter Cronkite at the time. This is a world without Twitter, or X I should call it. No social media, no 24-hour news, no, you can't just look up international news so easily, but back then. And there were many fears that he would be the first fatality in space. Of course, thankfully, he was recovered by the US Navy, and that didn't happen. And but it did cause some controversy, and Carpenter later left for the Sea Lab experiments, and Mallon makes the point he's the only person who's been up in space and also been down so far in the ocean. But it's a feeling that he left under a cloud, and because he was lucky to get the space flight, and he was the one who named Aurora 7. The original name was Delta, but the previous astronaut found out very late that he had a heart condition, so he was unable to do it. Okay, so I would say that Aurora 7, when it works, when you mix these characters together, famous, ordinary, JFK, schoolboys, life on Earth and then life up in the stars, the solitary existence of Scott Carpenter. When it works, it's wondrous. It's a wonderful novel. And it will take you back there in terms of how exciting this must be. Because, like Ellroy said to me, I find space exploration so boring. No interest in it whatsoever. But my knowledge of it is very spotty. I'm kind of fairly knowledgeable about, Sputnik 1 and Gagarin's first space mission, and then the early Apollo missions. And then there's this big gap, which this book covers. And what it must have been like, because it was a huge news story. I mean, if anyone who remembers it, watching this show, would like to write in and give me their memories. Now it seems to be all but forgotten. Maybe that's a 20th and 21st century thing. The science is moving so fast that an astounding discovery or achievement now, it seems very old hat 10 years from now. So when it works, it is fantastic. But when it doesn't work, I found that the whole bystanders technique gets a little bit... this character does this on this day, and this character does this at this particular hour. And I felt there were moments where my attention was beginning to lag. And I'm just being honest with you, because I only bring books on the show that I want to recommend for different reasons. But I'm recommending it with a bit of just a caution in terms of it's not to me as gripping as Thomas Mallon's novel on Watergate, which is just fantastic all the way through. But that goes to more my taste and to Ellroy's taste in terms of that political milieu is always fascinating towards us. But I know Ellroy, always speaks highly of Mallon's writing and has spoken highly of this book, and also has a surprising connection, which I'll get to just now. Now, as mentioned, Ellroy is about as far away as you can imagine from either a science fact or a science fiction writer. But when I was writing his biography and researching it, Love Me, Fears and Danger, I was surprised at the amount of connections he had to science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction writers. Very broad. I know that those terms can be kind of interchangeable at times, and sometimes they can be specific. But let's say broadly those types of writers. For instance, when Ellroy was in AA in Venice Beach, which was a very important time in his life because he got clean, and that's where he actually first started writing, he was friends with a writer by the name of Neil Hancock, who was quite well known at the time. He was a fellow AA member, and he'd got published first. He published a series of books called The Circle of Light Quartet. And he was very encouraging for Ellroy in all of his writing plans. And this was slightly maddening, but it was tantalizing. Neil Hancock took James Ellroy's first ever author photos because Ellroy had bagged a book deal with Avon, who were going to publish Brown's Requiem, his first novel. Now, he's living in LA. Avon, like most publishing, is based in New York, the capital of world publishing. They hadn't met him yet. They would meet him later, but Ellroy had already started a flirtation with his first editor, his first female editor, Nellie Saber, who I spoke to in the biography, wonderful woman. He'd started a flirtation with her, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to send you some photos." This is like late 1970s, early 1980s version of Tinder, I suppose. "I'll send you some author photos of me." Neil Hancock took those author photos. They were sent to Avon. I was unable to find them. All I found was a note um, saying, Nellie passing it round to everyone in the office, saying, "Well, here he is. This is James Ellroy," because his big personality and his kind of racy letters. They were causing gossip in Avon. Neil Hancock sadly passed away. I spoke to his family. I tried to get them to find the author photos because Avon didn't have them. Ellroy didn't have them. The people in Neil's family I spoke to were very helpful, but they couldn't find them. I think there'd been some sort of family rift and a lot of stuff had got thrown out. So I couldn't find those author photos, which I always thought was a terrible shame because they weren't just historically important in terms of literary history, Ellroy's first author photos. And two, I'm sure he looked his suavest, most seductive for them because he was carrying on this flirtation with Nellie Saban, which never went anywhere. I want to make that absolutely clear. And Ellroy saw Neil Hancock sporadically after that. Ellroy moved to New York. Neil Hancock moved back to Texas. But Ellroy said whenever I had a book reading in Texas, Neil would come along, a good guy. And sadly a little bit forgotten now as a writer, but there are still fans out there of the Circle of Light Quartet. And it's always nice when an author gets a kind of second wind and revisionism. So I go out and discover those books. Then Ellroy's next big friendship with what you call speculative fiction writer would be with Steve Erickson, who wrote has written many books, and they were actually close friends for a while. And Erickson actually house sat for him. They had a very abrupt falling out, which I'm not going to get into in this episode. Maybe in a future episode. But like they were very close, and Erickson was in at the LA Weekly, where Helen Canode also wrote, and he's a great writer, a great guy. And then Ellroy dated Susan Palwick, who's a wonderful woman. They actually met at a book reading group hosted by Samuel Chip Delaney, who is a fabulous science fiction writer. And Ellroy said to me, I joined this book group in New York because one, I'd moved across country, practically across continents, west coast to east coast, and wanted to meet people. Well, more specifically, he wanted to meet women. And he did. That's where he met Susan, and they became a couple. And I kind of go into this relationship in Love Me, Fist and Danger. I'm not going to repeat much of it now, but it went very well for a while, for a few months, and then it ended very abruptly. And you may find, rather like with Steve Erickson and now Susan Palwick, you may find, a pattern here between kind of intense romance, intense friendship, and then very sudden endings. But Susan Palwick's a wonderful woman and was also a hospital chaplain. I spoke to her at the height of lockdown, and she was doing chaplaincy work in the hospitals in New Mexico, and just a wonderful woman. Prior to Susan, Ellroy also dated another speculative fiction writer, Ellen Kushner. And he said it wasn't very serious with Ellen as it kind of was with Susan, but Ellen's another wonderful woman. And years later, after it was all over, and Ellen by this time was actually married to a woman, she has a house in France, and she's walking with a wife through, I can't remember if it's Toulouse or somewhere like that, Lille, or and she walks past a bookshop, and it's like, today, James Ellroy, because Ellroy's huge in France. And she's like, no way! I can't believe it. Oh, we've got to go see him. So she did. She went to see him, and she said he was charming. He was charming. All that old charm that kind of attracted me to him was still there. And so that was very nice. And then just to bring this full circle, when Ellroy moved to Denver because he reconciled with Helen Canode, they'd been divorced and he'd had some, let's say, traumatic years. Helen once described it to me as one long, unchecked descent into madness. Those traumatic years in LA, he moved to Denver and he reached out to Thomas Mallon because Thomas knows friends of Denver, and Thomas says, if you want to meet people, I can introduce you to the Carpenters, specifically Kristen Carpenter, who's was Scott Carpenter's daughter with Renee Carpenter, who was one of the most glamorous of the astronauts' wives, a real beauty. And Kristen Carpenter is married to Thomas Stover. So they became friends, their circle, and Ellroy attended the Episcopal Church with them in Denver. And so when I was writing the biography, I spoke to a handful of people Ellroy was friends with in Denver, because he's still relatively new moving there. And I spoke to Thomas Stover of that couple. And he's a lawyer. He was a good guy. He was very helpful. Kind of a stringent guy. I thought very, to the point, but very admiring of Ellroy. And I said, is there anything you really want me? My question is there anything you really want me? If you really want to tell me about Ellroy, you really want to get across. And he's very honest, and he's very serious, and he actually believes in God. Which is fine, great, because a lot of people out there who say they don't. So Tom Stover struck me as a kind of quite conservative guy in some respects, and I always thought he and Ellroy were kind of an odd pairing for the Episcopal Church, which is, as far as I know, is probably the most liberal church in the U.S. I mean, very much on the Christian left. They were fish out of water there, but I liked them, and it was a real kick to say, hey, I'm talking to the son-in-law of an astronaut here. Just fabulous. And it really just opened my eyes to Aurora 7 and how important it is, to the history of space exploration, and what a mostly marvelous novel Thomas Mallon has created here. Okay, thanks very much for watching. I'll be back next week, and make sure you don't miss me. Hit that subscribe button, and the episode will be delivered right to your inbox. Okay, thanks very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.